Hi, everybody. Welcome to Square Off. Eric Gage is joining us today. And Eric, today, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, the he's just not ready yet candidate, well, he wants election reforms to make voting mandatory. So I ask, how can you make a person vote? How can you make them want to vote? It just screams anti-democratic.
Yeah, you know, the percentage of the population that is voting at this time is at an all-time low. Something actually needs to be done to get people to the polls, and mandatory voting actually may be the answer, but we'll debate that later on Square Off.
The Supreme Court of Canada's ruling on how patients can consume medical marijuana led to cheers from advocates, but angered the governing Conservatives. Medical marijuana has been legal in Canada for nearly 15 years, but it was only legal for patients to smoke.
Yeah, but smoking anything is, of course, not a healthy option, and many patients who rely on medical marijuana to treat their medical issues found eating the drug in cookies or other forms, such as tea, a better way to get to their medicine.
Joining us now to talk about the ruling is criminal lawyer Jeff Manishen, who also has experience working as a Crown attorney. Jeff, for many people, the Supreme Court's decision seemed like a no-brainer, really. So why was there a difference in the law for the way that patients could take their medical marijuana?
It's a really good question, Liz, the why. I think perhaps we could say that the acceptance of the medicinal value of medical marijuana is something that may have been accepted gradually over time. So back, I think in 2003, the medical marijuana access regulations permitted license to be obtained for medicinal use of marijuana, providing it was dried marijuana. That's all the legislation provided for. And that was revised to some extent and reenacted by the Harper Conservatives a couple of years ago, but the medical marijuana being limited to dried marijuana remained in place. Well, a fellow out in BC who had produced some marijuana in other forms for medicinal purposes, including in cookies, in gels, in capsules, and massage oils, he was found with the stuff. He was charged with unlawful possession and production of marijuana. He took issue with the constitutional validity of that restriction component of the regulations, and he succeeded.
So, Federal Health Minister Rona Ambrose, she expressed her outrage at the court's decision. Why would they suddenly, or I mean, I know they're sort of against it to begin with, but why outrage over this?
I guess probably in 3 words to describe the Harper government attitude on marijuana: drugs are bad. Very simple. Because don't forget, they're the same government that increased the mandatory minimums for growing marijuana. You can get 6 months in jail for growing 6 plants or more. You can get a year for growing over 200 plants.
So are they legit outrage, or is this just a political move on their part?
I think it's ideology-based outrage. It's consistent with the idea of we think drugs are bad, and that's a philosophy they've taken in other respects. It's kind of difficult because the health ministry has some direct interest in the medicinal use of marijuana by way of oversight and administration. And in fact, Health Canada actually had done some studies and some materials which were filed by the Crown on the Smith case showing that there is a medicinal benefit to non-dried marijuana, and that was part of the ruling. Why Minister Ambrose didn't read the judgment, I don't know, but I think her outrage would be moderated if she looked at the material federal prosecutors filed that was research done by Health Canada. And the idea of it is essentially this. As you mentioned earlier, Eric, to smoke marijuana, there are certainly risks in relation to bronchial and other infections and difficulties that can come if that's the only way in which you can have the drug. To be able to take it in non-dried form, it can be better for the individual suffering from chronic pain. It doesn't bring into play those risks in relation to health considerations. And that was at the core of the decision. It was unconstitutional because the court found it infringed people's right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice.
I wonder, too, though, Jeff, you know, it's going to be a whole lot harder to catch someone if they've got brownies to know that they're marijuana brownies or that it's a marijuana tea. How much does this does it affect the fact that less arrests can be made over foodstuffs and oils and teas than they can be over an actual bag of pot?
Well, sure, I guess that's true, Liz, but you could say the same with respect to who does and doesn't have a certificate, or who does or doesn't have a prescription, I should really say, to be able to get the drug. I don't believe that this decision was predicated on measures for enforcement. In fact, the argument that was put forward by the federal Crown to say, no, keep the legislation as it is in the interest of public safety and health. But again, the court found, well, that doesn't make any sense. In fact, the research doesn't show that they have any specific restrictions on what happens with respect to dried marijuana. If you took it and you boiled it down and put it into a tea, that's okay. But if you have it in some other non-liquid form to get the THC component out of it that's not dried, that's not okay. The court called it a total disconnect between objective and method of practice.
So what's the move for the Conservatives now? Because Ambrose says the federal government's not going to just, they're going to react to this so-called normalization of marijuana.
I would probably say they'll take the same kind of approach as they did on the issue of assisted suicide. You remember the Supreme Court of Canada said, look, that's got to be addressed and we'll see some legislation. They said that back in February, and the government took the position, well, we'll give it a further study. We won't hear the answers to those study until after the election. This is if it's a potential election issue, they don't want to put forward the position of we respect that decision and we're okay with it. That doesn't appeal to their base. Remember again, if the ideology is marijuana is bad, drugs are bad, we'll only go along with a limited form of marijuana for medicinal purposes, and we'll dig our heels in on that. And the court says, no, that's wrong. That's unconstitutional. Maybe it takes the people of Canada to be able to say, we value charter-based principles. We value liberty and security of the person. We value measures that aren't arbitrary. Well, I'm speaking like a politician, and I don't want to be one.
Well, you're sounding pretty good, actually. Are they afraid that we're moving closer to actually legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana? Is that one of their concerns?
Well, we say the Harper government, I don't know that they're afraid of anything, but
True.
We've seen Justin Trudeau may well be putting forward that he thinks marijuana should be legalized. The farthest that the Harper government has indicated they may do is to suggest it could be decriminalized. So it's taken out of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act and may be dealt with simple possession of small amounts in another way so you don't get a criminal record. I don't know if we'll hear that as part of the election platform, though.
Okay, Jeff, I want to switch gears now. A report from the Public Safety Ministry says that the majority of Aboriginal offenders in federal prison are actually held long past the date they become eligible for parole. Almost 85% of Aboriginal inmates remain in prison for the duration of their sentence, whereas about 69% of non-Aboriginal inmates face the same fate. So what does the study suggest to you? Does it make sense? Are you surprised?
I guess I'm not too surprised because remember, to get parole at a third, the parole board will be looking at various risk factors. They'll look at history of drug or alcohol or other substance abuse. They'll look at employment opportunities. They'll look at roots in the community. They'll look at supportive family, their stability of background and upbringing. And there's a host of factors that are objective risk factors that the board will evaluate and say the person can or can't get parole. And we have a difficulty from the standpoint of the overall social fabric, as we saw in the Truth and Consequences of Truth and Reconciliation report. There are real issues in terms of those sorts of problems for Aboriginals. And so almost dealt in, an Aboriginal offender coming into a penitentiary system may well have a much more difficult chance to be able to show that he or she does not fit within those risk factors, and accordingly may wind up doing 2/3 of the sentence rather than 1/3. And then the problem is there's no supervision in terms of release into the community. Much better success rate for individuals released on parole, not reoffending. Worst category, those who are held to the 2/3 for its mandatory supervision or statutory release date.
So why then? Why is it I mean, you said it doesn't surprise us, and unfortunately you're right. This report is nothing new. We've sort of heard this for decades about how Aboriginals, they're sort of filling our correctional facilities at higher rates. Why the imbalance then?
I think probably, Eric, because the parole board will simply look at objective categories that aren't race-based, that aren't background-based. They'll simply go by statistics and other considerations to say, objectively viewed, here's our 10-point checklist. And the difficulty is if that's the checklist you're going to use and you don't allow for particular personal circumstances or look at potential extra support needed for Aboriginal offenders, they will not score as well. They may well be in a position where they simply can't succeed in getting parole based on those criteria.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for your time. That's Jeff Manishen. We appreciate your input and your expertise, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
It's always a pleasure.
When we come back, we're going to get down and dirty on the safety of hand sanitizers.
Yeah. So do you know what happens after you've swathed your hands in some of that stuff? Well, we've got our medical expert to help settle the debate on whether you want to keep doing it or not.
It's the solution. Germ-free.